You thought losing them was the end of everything, but what if it was just the beginning? What if that heartbreak wasn't breaking you, but revealing you? You didn't lose the one person who completed you. You found the parts of yourself you forgot you had. This isn't about starting over with someone else. This is about finally starting with you. Because the real victory isn't who stays, it's who you become when they don't. There's a moment many people reach in life when they realize staying in a certain situation is no longer a reflection of strength, loyalty, or endurance. It's a slow erosion of their peace. That moment often comes quietly, like a whisper, not a scream. It doesn't always come after a big argument or dramatic ending. Sometimes it comes after one too many times being overlooked, one too many silent tears, or one too many compromises that cost more than they should. And when that moment arrives, the decision to walk away isn't made from bitterness or pride, it's made from wisdom. There's a false narrative that choosing to let go means giving up, or that walking away is a sign of defeat. But those are ideas rooted in ego and misunderstanding. Walking away, especially when there is still love or care present, takes tremendous courage. It means you finally realize that staying any longer would mean continuing to betray yourself. And that is no longer an option. Letting go becomes the turning point. It's where self-awareness deepens. It's where the noise begins to quiet. It's where a person begins to hear themselves again. All those moments they silenced their needs to keep someone else comfortable. All those times they swallowed their feelings to avoid conflict start to surface. Not as regrets, but as clarity. It wasn't that they were being too much. It wasn't that they needed to fix themselves to be accepted. It was that they were trying to thrive in an environment not built to nourish who they truly are. And so they choose the door, the silent one, the calm one, the one that requires no permission and no announcement. They walk away not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves. That's the power of wisdom, choosing peace over chaos, choosing alignment over attachment, choosing growth over comfort. This kind of wisdom isn't loud. It doesn't post an explanation. It doesn't seek validation for its decision. It simply moves. And in that movement, there's a transformation. Suddenly, the world feels different, not because it changed, but because the lens through which it's viewed has changed. The lens is no longer fogged with fear of being alone or the weight of emotional confusion. The lens is clear, and through it, there is a powerful realization. Staying would have cost too much. Often when people look back at the decision to walk away, they don't remember it as the day they lost someone. They remember it as the day they came home to themselves, the moment they reclaimed the parts of them they had been handing away for too long. The moment they remembered they're not hard to love, they were just in a space where love was conditional. It's easy to be convinced that holding on is the strength, that keeping something intact, no matter how much it hurts, is noble. But real strength is in recognizing when something no longer honors your value and having the emotional maturity to release it, without malice, without blame, just release. That kind of release is sacred. It doesn't carry the energy of revenge or resentment. It's grounded in self-respect. With time, people begin to see that nothing they lost was really meant to be permanent. What leaves when you rise in your self-worth is not a loss, it's a clearing. What remains is meant. What grows after is intentional, and what comes hides. As next is a life more aligned with who they're becoming, not who they were shrinking to be. In the quiet after walking away, something beautiful happens. The constant noise of trying to be enough fades. The anxious need to read between lines or decode mixed signals disappears. What's left is space. Space to feel, space to reflect, space to breathe again without holding tension in your shoulders or second-guessing your worth. This space becomes sacred. In it, there's room for rediscovery. Passions that were set aside come back to life. Boundaries that were once hard to enforce become non-negotiable. Self-care is no longer a luxury, it's a priority. There's less explaining, more protecting, less proving, more being. People often ask how to know when it's time to walk away. And the answer isn't always obvious. It's not always about the presence of something toxic or abusive. Sometimes it's the absence that's louder, the absence of connection, consistency, growth, empathy. Sometimes it's the subtle patterns, the small ways you compromise your voice, your values, your peace. And when that realization lands, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to step back and choose differently. That choice doesn't need to be understood by others. It only needs to be true to you. And truth has a quiet power. It doesn't scream for attention. It simply feels right. It settles in your chest like relief. It grounds you. It strengthens your steps. And even if sadness comes with it, there's peace underneath. You begin to realize that leaving isn't the end. It's the beginning of something you didn't even know you were missing, a relationship with yourself that doesn't require performance, a connection to your own heart that doesn't feel like hard work, a sense of home that isn't attached to anyone else's presence. The decision to walk away, when made from wisdom and not wounded pride, becomes one of the most empowering choices a person can make. It's the moment self-abandonment ends and self-honor begins, not because you were trying to make a point, but because your soul finally whispered, "No more." And for the first time you listened. It's often in the stillness, the silence after chaos, where the truth finally begins to surface. The human heart wasn't meant to live in noise, emotional noise, mental clutter, the noise of mixed signals and second-guessing. When the noise fades, clarity begins to form like a fog lifting after a long, stormy night. What once felt confusing suddenly seems obvious. What was tolerated begins to look unacceptable. And the version of self that once felt powerless starts to regain its voice. For a long time, it's easy to stay stuck in situations where the mind is always trying to make sense of someone else's actions. Days are spent decoding text messages, questioning tone, wondering what went wrong, or bending backward to maintain connection. In this kind of environment, the focus is rarely on self-understanding. It becomes all about maintaining attachment. And attachment, when it's rooted in fear, demands more than it gives. It becomes a cycle of overthinking, overfunctioning, and overextending. In that space, clarity cannot exist. But when distance enters the equation, whether emotional, physical, or both, everything shifts. The noise starts to fade. No more explanations to chase. No more behaviors to interpret. No more walking on eggshells to avoid upsetting someone. It is in that quiet space where the internal voice, once drowned out by the desire to be chosen, becomes audible again. That voice says, "I miss who I was before I got lost in trying to make this work." It's a powerful realization to recognize just how much of oneself was placed on the back burner. How many times joy was postponed, energy was depleted, and boundaries were ignored in hopes of being accepted. That recognition doesn't come easily, but once it lands, it's undeniable. And when someone reaches that place, they're not just walking away from a relationship or situation, they're walking back to themselves. Clarity is often mistaken for coldness, but it isn't. It's not numbness. It's peace. It's the sudden awareness that love shouldn't be confusing, that care shouldn't come with conditions, that being close to someone shouldn't mean losing sight of one's own needs. The clearer someone becomes, the more obvious it is what they allowed and why they allowed it. And that's where the real healing begins, not in blaming, not in shaming, but in understanding. Understanding the version of oneself who stayed, who tried, who hoped. That version wasn't weak. It was just waiting for a moment of clarity strong enough to make a change. When the chaos ends, the mind and heart begin to recalibrate. The things that once felt so essential no longer carry the same weight. Texts that used to cause anxiety now go unread. Words that once caused pain begin to lose their power. What changes is not just the situation, it's the inner landscape. The relationship with self starts to strengthen. People often confuse silence for emptiness, but silence can be full of reflection, full of insight, full of truth. When no one else's voice is filling the space, your own finally gets to take the lead. And that voice knows what it wants, it knows what hurts, it knows what was sacrificed, and it knows what it needs moving forward. Clarity doesn't always feel like fireworks. Sometimes it's quiet and calm. Sometimes it's a steady breath after a long period of holding it in. Sometimes it's as simple as recognizing, I deserve better than what I accepted. That single thought can shift a life. And with clarity comes responsibility. Once someone sees the truth, they can't unsee it. They're no longer willing to settle for half commitments or inconsistent effort. They begin to recognize red flags not as invitations to try harder, but as reminders to protect their peace. This shift isn't about becoming guarded or hard, it's about becoming intentional. It's about filtering out the noise so the decisions made from this point forward are rooted in self-worth, not self-doubt. From this place, love becomes a choice, not a need. Connection becomes a gift, not a survival tool. Clarity also allows for compassion. When distance gives space to reflect, it's easier to understand others without excusing them. It becomes possible to acknowledge their pain or limitations while still affirming, that's not mine to carry. This is a mature form of detachment, one that's rooted in peace rather than resentment. And once clarity is gained, life begins to look different. Priorities shift. What once seemed like the end now feels like the beginning. The emotional energy that was once tied up in trying to be understood is now free to be redirected into growth. New dreams emerge, old passions reignite, boundaries become clearer, self-trust rebuilds. In time, there's even gratitude for the experience, not because of the pain, but because of the transformation. Because without the noise, the truth would have remained buried. Because without the confusion, the clarity wouldn't have been so sharp. And because in losing something externally, something internal was finally found. That's the paradox. What felt like loss was actually the beginning of reclamation. And the greatest clarity of all is realizing that nothing you've lost is greater than what you've gained within. There's something deeply transformative about reaching a moment when the patterns finally become clear. For so long, a person can get caught in the cycle of trying, giving, compromising, and hoping, waiting for the other side to meet them halfway. And even when that doesn't happen, they often stay because the investment is deep. Time, energy, emotion, all poured into building something that feels meaningful. But there comes a breaking point. A subtle but undeniable realization. This isn't just about them and I more. This is about self-preservation. In the beginning, people often ignore the small discomforts. They convince themselves it's just a phase, a misunderstanding, or something they can work through with more patience. So they wait, they try harder, they shrink in the places they once stood tall just to avoid rocking the boat. They become fluent in the language of silence because speaking up feels too costly. They trade authenticity for temporary harmony, even as it chips away at their peace. But the truth always finds a way to surface, and it usually does in quiet moments, the kind where nothing is being said, yet everything is felt. The emptiness in conversations, the lack of reciprocity, the one-sided emotional labor, it all begins to add up. Eventually, the internal dissonance becomes too loud to ignore. That's when the real shift begins. When someone reaches that internal threshold, it's no longer about fixing the relationship or convincing someone of their worth. It becomes about reclaiming their identity, reclaiming the parts of themselves they had silenced to keep the connection alive. And that is no small act. It requires courage to look in the mirror and admit that the person looking back no longer resembles who they once were. It takes strength to acknowledge that they've been negotiating their value in the hopes of being chosen. But the deeper truth is this: when someone constantly contorts themselves to fit a space that doesn't honor them, they lose more than just peace. They lose pieces of themselves. And that loss is invisible to others, but it's deeply felt within. It shows up as emotional fatigue, lowered self-worth, and a quiet ache that never really goes away. Walking away from that pattern is not about anger or resentment. It's about choosing self-alignment, choosing to stop fighting for someone who doesn't show up, choosing to stop proving, pleasing, or performing, choosing to end the internal war between self-loyalty and external validation. That's where true empowerment begins. Reclaiming oneself isn't loud. It doesn't always look like bold declarations or dramatic exits. Sometimes it's in the small decisions. the ones no one sees. Turning off the phone instead of waiting for a message that never comes. Saying no to the bare minimum. Choosing solitude over emotional confusion. These are the quiet revolutions that change everything. With each act of self-honoring, the fog begins to lift. The mind clears, the heart breathes, and there's space to remember who they were before they began watering dead plants, space to explore joy that isn't conditional, space to grieve the fantasy they held on to while stepping into the truth of what they need. And what they need isn't complicated. It's consistency, safety, reciprocity, connection that doesn't demand they erase themselves to maintain it. Love that doesn't come at the cost of self-respect. These aren't unreasonable desires, they are basic emotional needs. And once someone truly recognizes that, they stop settling for fragments of love disguised as the whole. This is where the journey inward begins in earnest. The energy that was once used to sustain something external is now redirected inward, into healing, into rediscovery, into becoming whole again, not because someone else filled the gap, but because they stopped abandoning themselves. They begin to see that their capacity to love deeply was never the problem. Their empathy, their loyalty, their commitment, none of that was a flaw. It was simply being given in the wrong direction. And now that same love is being returned inward, not in a selfish way, but in a restorative one. Because when a person gives themselves the love they were waiting to receive, they become unshakable. From this place, everything begins to shift. Relationships are viewed through a different lens. Tolerance for emotional inconsistency disappears. Communication becomes more direct. Boundaries become second nature. And connection, when it happens, is chosen, not chased. This transformation doesn't mean the past didn't matter. It simply means it no longer defines the future. What was once seen as a heartbreak is now understood as a redirection. What once felt like a failure is now recognized as a breakthrough. And what once felt like abandonment is now reframed as liberation. The power lies in choosing self-alignment over self-betrayal, in recognizing that the most important relationship is the one a person has with themselves. Because when that relationship is strong, everything else falls into place. Choices become clearer, standards rise, peace becomes non-negotiable. There is nothing more empowering than realizing you don't need to be saved. You only need to stop abandoning your own needs. You don't need to beg for love. You only need to love yourself enough to walk away when it's not being given freely. You don't need to be chosen by someone else. You only need to choose yourself, fully and without hesitation. And that choice changes everything, not overnight, but steadily, one day at a time, one boundary at a time, one act of self-respect at a time, until the life being built is no longer rooted in survival, but in truth, in alignment, and in deep, grounded peace. There is a quiet, powerful moment that comes after heartbreak, one that's rarely talked about. It happens after the tears have dried, after the confusion has settled, and after the need for answers fades into the background. It is the moment when, for the first time in a long time, a person looks around and realizes life didn't end. In fact, something deeper began, a shift, a reawakening, the beginning of coming home to oneself. So often people believe that losing someone means they've failed, that somehow, if things had been different, if they had said the right things, done more, tried harder, the outcome would have changed. That belief can create a loop of self-blame and regret that plays endlessly in the mind. But slowly, that loop breaks. Not all at once, but in pieces. A laugh escapes. A peaceful night's sleep returns. The silence, once deafening, becomes comforting. And with that comfort comes a new clarity. The end wasn't a failure, it was a redirection. There's an inner strength that surfaces when someone moves forward, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. That strength doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't need to. It shows up in the decisions made each day to honor what's real, what's true, and what brings peace. It's in choosing stillness over chaos and authenticity over approval. It's in the realization that love isn't meant to feel like a battlefield. In the space that follows a loss, something else blooms, identity. The parts of the self that were dimmed, sacrificed, or silenced for the sake of maintaining a connection begin to re-emerge. Passions resurface, curiosity reignites. That person who once adapted to fit someone else's world starts creating their own again, a world built on purpose, values, and unapologetic self-expression. This rediscovery isn't linear. Some days it still hurts. Some memories still sting. Healing isn't about pretending those emotions don't exist. It's about learning to hold them with compassion. It's about making space for the grief without letting it govern the present, because the present has so much more to offer. Each step forward, no matter how small, is a declaration of self-worth. Each boundary drawn is a reminder, I matter. Each moment of solitude becomes sacred, not lonely. Time alone no longer feels like waiting, it feels like becoming. As this transformation unfolds, there's a deeper truth that begins to take root. The loss of a relationship isn't the loss of love. It's the loss of a particular form of love, one that may not have been sustainable, balanced, or held high. But love itself still lives on in new forms, in friendships that feel like family, in art that stirs the soul, in quiet mornings, kind strangers, and the courage to begin again. What truly changes is the relationship with the self. Where there was once doubt, there is now trust. Where there was once fear, there is now resilience. Where there was once a need to be chosen, there is now a deep knowing, I choose myself. That kind of knowing doesn't make someone bitter, it makes them whole. And when wholeness becomes the foundation, everything else changes. Future relationships are no longer about completion, they are about collaboration. They are no longer rooted in fear of being alone, but in joy of being together. Standards rise, expectations are clearer, and love becomes something freely given and freely received, not bartered or begged for. The journey to this place isn't easy. It requires looking at the truth without turning away. It demands letting go of fantasy in favor of reality, but it also offers something beautiful in return, the freedom to be fully alive, the freedom to stop performing and start being, to stop waiting and start living. There is a kind of peace that can't be found through someone else. It comes only from living in alignment with one's own truth. It's the peace of knowing that no matter who stays or goes, you will not abandon yourself again. That kind of peace is unshakable. Eventually, gratitude begins to replace regret, not for the pain itself, but for the growth it inspired. Because without the breaking, the rebuilding wouldn't have happened. Without the silence, the inner voice wouldn't have grown louder. And without the ending, the new beginning wouldn't have had space to arrive. This is where the real beauty lies, not in proving anything to anyone, not in being seen as strong or unbothered, but in quietly, steadily becoming someone who is no longer willing to compromise their peace for temporary comfort. Someone who knows their worth, honors their path, and trusts that what is meant will never require self-abandonment. And so, the story shifts, not as a tragedy, but as a rebirth. The narrative is no longer centered around loss, but around return. A return to inner wisdom, a return to joy, a return to self, not the self that was shaped by pain, but the one that was always there, waiting to be remembered. In the end, the most powerful realization of all is this: nothing truly meaningful is ever lost when you find yourself in the process. What remains is stronger, wiser, and more rooted than before. And that foundation, built through truth, healed through time, and nurtured with compassion, is the starting point for a life that no longer needs to be earned, but simply lived